40 minutes, I'd like to share some insights derived from about a decade of research on the digitalization of environmental governance, of which water is an important topic. But the trends that I'm going to discuss today are much broader than water. In fact, I would like to propose that environmental governance at a planetary scale is currently undergoing a profound process of digitalization that is very important for those of us engaged in environmental governance to understand and then intervene in. So with that backdrop, let me paint a picture of the digital water debate. Over the past couple of decades, a considerable amount of digital innovation has occurred in both marine water and fresh water. And I don't have time today to talk about marine environments, so I will just talk about freshwater. But broadly speaking, this innovation has involved the application of digital monitoring, digital data analysis, and digital decision-making to water-related environments. Now, proponents of digitalization argue that the abundance of data, the more rapid decision-making, will lead to better environmental outcomes. But opponents make very serious arguments about the potential negative implications of the digitalization of water governance. And I will explore both the proponents and the opponents' arguments today. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because I believe we are going through a profound transformation in water governance that will dramatically alter the role that water plays in development and societal evolution more broadly. If we share a belief in the importance of sustainability, and if we accept that climate change will lead to intensification of hazards such as floods or droughts or extreme rain events, the digitalization of water could be very important in hazard mitigation and in managing scarce water resources. But there's another argument here that really connects the, if you like, technical administrative dimensions of digital water management to political ecology and to the socioeconomic dimensions of governance. And that is the argument that through digitalization, we can democratize water governance. We can incorporate citizens in new and meaningful ways in decision-making. Now, I'm not agreeing with this statement, but I'm sketching out the argument. Proponents of the digital water agenda believe that we will have better water management outcomes and a more democratic process for managing water. Now, skeptics respond with a series of concerns with which you may be familiar if you follow digital debates more generally. So the digitalization of water governance in particular, and environmental governance more generally, raises concerns about privacy, transparency, and data colonialism. For those of you who aren't familiar with that last term, the concept of data colonialism is rooted in debates over Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous data sovereignty. So that's particularly important. Speaking as I am from Canada, which is a colonial settler state in which Indigenous governance is in some cases widespread, and in which we operate under a system of legal pluralism. So in Canada, we have the common law inherited from England, the civil or Napoleonic code inherited from France, and we have Indigenous law which obviously predates those legal systems and is a living legal order in Canada recognized by our Supreme Court. So the implications of the term data colonialism have a lot to do with Indigenous resurgence and decolonizing efforts, about which I'll say more in the question period if you're interested. Skeptics also raise concern about the materiality of digital water, the massive water and energy demands that digital infrastructures require in the context of very uneven hydrosocial risks, which are, of course, exacerbated by climate change. Now, the argument here is that the risks of digital water, which deepens the digital divide, will be disproportionately borne by underserved communities. So this is deeply ironic because digital water is presented as a sort of liberatory progressive agenda, but it may be deeply regressive. It may be very negative for underserved communities. Now, you may be wondering how I'm defining digital water. I am using a socio-political, socio-technical definition that draws on science and technology studies and the sociology of scientific knowledge, in which I understand digital water as a computational apparatus that is simultaneously material and intangible, simultaneously technical and socio-political and socioeconomic. We can divide this socio-technical assemblage into three categories. The first category is instrumentation. So here I'm referring to the massive proliferation of digital devices that collect data, often in an automated fashion. So these are things like environmental sensor networks, drones, nanosatellites, aquatic gliders, very widely used in marine environments, or even cell phone-based interfaces, increasingly used in water-related applications in precision agriculture. So instrumentation refers, if you like, to all the hardware, the physical things we place in the environment to monitor Earth and water. The second category is interconnectedness, which refers to cloud-based computing and internet-based databases that enable an exponential increase in data to be collected and shared, possibly, distributed amongst citizens, and including those citizens who are practicing a form of digital science, so citizen scientists, experts, and even non-humans. It's very interesting to note that increasingly the digital Earth agenda enrolls non-humans in the act of collecting data and perhaps even receiving that data. So this requires another layer of hardware and software that stores data, organizes data, shares data, and of course, many struggles will be waged over that data in the future. The third category is intelligence, and this refers to artificial intelligence, such as neural networks and machine learning, data science, and other computational techniques that enable the automation and acceleration of data analysis and decision-making. Now, this has transformative potential for social learning and adaptive water management because this combination, these three categories, instrumentation, interconnectedness, and intelligence, reverse two prior constraints of 20th century environmental management. So the first constraint that many of you will know well is the lack of data on environmental or water issues. It is a constant complaint. We don't have enough data about the environment. With digital water, we have the opposite problem. We have an abundance of data. We have a tsunami of data. We literally are awash in data. And our response to this abundance, this hyperabundance of data, then raises the second reversal. The problem experienced in 20th century environmental management was that often our management responses were too late. So a pollution event would occur, this might be detected, the responsible polluter might be fined or in other ways punished or sanctioned, but the fish would be dead in the river because of the pollution. So there was always a post hoc, a lag in governance decision-making, partly related to our lack of data. But what the digital water agenda does is it reverses that constraint. We now have predictive capability, and we have the power to engage in real-time governance. Immediate responses, immediate, for example, sanctions or punishments for something like water pollution. So digital water is not just a computational apparatus. It is the, if you like, foundation for a very different type of environmental governance that is data intensive, that is partially automated, that is predictive and real time. And that, of course, pertains to all environmental issues, not just water. But let's now explore some examples of how this is being applied to freshwater. So I'm going to discuss two examples, one with groundwater in California and the other with urban water in the global south. But before I do that, I want to emphasize the rapid digital transformation that is occurring in some parts of the world. There's a very nice quote from a novel by William Gibson. The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So given that the future is already here, but only some regions are experiencing it intensely, I'm going to give you some examples of where digital water agendas are well advanced. Now, let me set the stage for those case studies, if you like, by talking about the digital transformation they've experienced. So one point about the digital transformation agenda is that it creates a new kind of tension, a tension between centralized forms of digital monitoring, data storage, and analysis, and decentralized yet digitally enabled modalities of citizen science and management. This further deepens a well-known dynamic in water management, a dynamic of shifting inclusion and exclusion, right? Intersectional equity issues. So I'll illustrate that in my case studies. And let's consider, although there are many, many technologies to consider, I'm going to confine my discussion to the implications of remote sensing and sensor technologies and digital water and citizen science. So let's review those quickly, and then I'll dive into the case studies. So you may be aware of the rapid proliferation of remote sensing, dozens of Earth satellites, and the proliferation of the purposes of those satellites. So we now have satellites that are specifically dedicated just to monitoring animal movements, so movement ecology. We have other satellites that are used primarily for sensing geophysical aspects of the Earth. But you may be less aware of how those satellites are connected to environmental sensor networks that can be static, fixed in place, or mobile. Drones, terrestrial or aquatic, aerial or submarine, are being widely used to instrument, to wire up lakes, rivers, oceans. Many of the actors in these initiatives are big tech companies as well as scientists. So most of the big technology companies like Google, like IBM, would have very major environmental agendas. Microsoft, for example, invested $50 million, $50 million in an artificial intelligence for Earth initiative a few years ago and appointed its first chief environmental scientist. The reason for this is that environmental data is like a new frontier that can be harvested. And remarkably, it is free from the basic protections that human data has attached to it. So in addition to harvesting the data with these remote sensing and sensor technologies, there's a great deal of interest in experimenting on this data in the absence of the sort of ethics or privacy legislation that applies to human data. So I'll give you one example. The use of bioacoustics data is very widespread. The recording of the acoustics of non-humans, whales, bats, birds, elephants. And those data sets are widely used to work out some very complex problems that are relevant to human applications, voice to text, translation between different languages. So there's been a major investment in environmental acoustic data on the part of technology companies. So this investment in the harvesting of data is broader than water, but water is one example. This creates the data deluge, as I mentioned. And then there has been a response in terms of the creation of artificial intelligence and machine learning systems to analyze and, if you like, operationalize that data, particularly in the interests of better management. But of course, this has been, if you like, instrumentalized by big tech and capitalism, particularly to advance new real-time decision support systems in sectors like precision agriculture. So the automation of management, so the automation of water withdrawals, irrigation, often aligned with the automation of pesticide application and crop rotation. These are very common techniques that are applied for decision support. Now, the risks here are many. They include algorithmic bias, a lack of transparency, and of course, the fact that these technologies are only available in certain regions to certain people and controlled by a handful of companies. So the counter move has been to advocate for a digital citizen science, whereby this abundance of data is made available to citizens to enable new forms of user engagement. So advocates of citizen science argue that the abundance of data and the desire to democratize decision-making requires that we adopt new approaches to polycentric monitoring and governance. So a practical suggestion here is that citizens can use digital data to monitor compliance with environmental protections, water regulations, for example, and also directly spur enforcement action. So there has been a rapid rise in, for example, digital crowdsourcing of hydrological monitoring, where ordinary citizens go out and monitor water and report the results on digital applications on their smartphone or smart devices. Social media is also widely used. There's some fascinating experiments using WhatsApp and other social media interfaces for water monitoring. And again, non-humans can be deployed as well by placing sensors on marine freshwater organisms. We can actually engage in a form of environmental monitoring that is like biologging. So the risks here are multiple. It is, of course, a sort of utopian ideal to believe that digital data could be democratized, but it does raise issues of privacy. It also raises issues of consent, because every user that is connected to the internet, either through their smartphone or the Internet of Things, is potentially a citizen scientist as well as a censor, although they may be gathering data without their knowledge or without their consent. So this raises the specter, the concern about surveillance eco-capitalism. So you might be aware of debates about surveillance capitalism of humans. This is the environmental equivalent, surveillance eco-capitalism, mobilizing environmental data to generate capital accumulation. Two more concerns, particularly raised by scientists, are data quality. Often the data is still poor and poorly integrated. And human bycatch, that is the inadvertent monitoring of humans that arises through monitoring of the environment. So with that as backdrop, let's briefly discuss the two case studies. I've written a whole paper on this, but in the interest of time, I'm going to only briefly summarize them because I do want to allow a lot of time for questions. All right, so one example of digital water is occurring in California, home of Silicon Valley, one is perhaps not surprised that the digital agenda has been very intense, particularly in California's Central Valley, which produces a significant amount of the agricultural produce, not only for California, but for the entire continent. So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is a great example of legislation that has spurred changes in water governance and created an opening for digital applications. This particular piece of legislation was a response to the drawdown of the subterranean water, the aquifers in California, and in particular in the Central Valley, and related concerns about subsidence, so the settling of the soil surface, as well as saltwater intrusion, because of course, as you're drawing down the aquifer for agricultural use, you're creating negative pressure, simply put, and you get a lot of saltwater intrusion from the coast. The long-term implications are that salinization, subsidence, and the exhaustion of the water resources in the Central Valley could make agriculture very difficult or impossible in that region, which would be actually a very important threat to food security in North America. A lot of the food we get here in Vancouver is from California in the winter, although it's several thousand kilometers away. So there has been a massive effort to mobilize digital water techniques in the Central Valley. One example is interferometric synthetic aperture radar, INSAR, that can monitor subsidence and saltwater intrusion in real time. These techniques are almost science fiction in their capabilities. You can actually image below the surface of the earth to see water quantity and also assess water quality. This functions much like MRI, a magnetic resonance imaging device for the earth. So remote sensing satellites, all of these environmental sensors have been distributed across the Central Valley to monitor water, and particularly groundwater. And another layer has been developed that is largely intent on monitoring the relationship between water and crops. So you have precision agriculture sensors, precision sensors on irrigation devices, humidity sensors in soils, and very interesting sensors on the plants themselves to detect their level of hydration. If we had time, I would love to talk about the very advanced technology that's used here, just because it's so interesting. For example, plants under stress emit ultrasound. There are all sorts of ways that digital techniques can detect hydric stress in plants. So this is a very elaborate digital infrastructure that's constantly being innovated and updated, and precision agriculture is very, very big business. If you ever go to the Central Valley, you will experience it as a hyper industrialized landscape. It feels like being in a very strange outdoor plant factory. It's a very, very unsettling experience on these farms that don't actually feel like farms. They feel like industrial production sites. So along with this application of this digital apparatus in the Central Valley in California has come citizen science, where citizens are monitoring wastewater. They are attempting to implement environmentally friendly applications alongside and in tension with this intensive agricultural agenda. I'll just give you one example. The Central Valley, in addition to being a key site of agricultural production, is also a key site for migrating birds. A large number of species migrate from the Arctic down to the tropics, Mexico, Latin America. And on that annual migration, they stop in the Central Valley. It's very essential to their survival. The depletion of water and climate change has meant that many of the sites that birds would have used, marshes, etc., have dried up. And that is actually creating catastrophic consequences for these iconic bird species. So one digital application here involves the digital curation of migration sites for birds, which need to be wet. That functions a lot like an Airbnb. So imagine Airbnb, but instead of having rooms and travelers, you have flooded fields and birds. So this Airbnb system functions on the basis of an auction and relies on a very large network of citizen scientists all across the continent, combined with sensors and satellites. The satellites are tracking the birds. The tracking is verified by sensors and by observations of birders, citizen scientists on the ground, who upload their information to a very large database called eBird that's run by the Cornell University. This has tens of millions of observations that gives a pretty good sense of where the migrating birds are on their trajectory. Working with environmental organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Cornell University is able to predict where birds are going to land in the Central Valley and when they're going to land, and then create an auction that would essentially pay farmers a certain amount of money to flood their fields, which is not necessarily good for agricultural purposes, but which is very good to welcome the birds. And as those auctions run and farmers bid on the right to be paid to flood their fields, essentially what you're creating is something like pop-up stores. I'm not sure how you say pop-up stores in French, but they're these little stores that come and go, and their success is enabled by digital and social media. We're creating pop-up wetlands that would be essentially flooded right before the birds arrive, to ensure that when they arrive, they are not encountering a dry landscape which has no food, no water. So this initiative has been remarkably successful in increasing the diversity of bird species, the abundance of members of those species, and enhancing biodiversity. So this is just one example of the many innovative digital solutions that are being applied to environmental issues and water-related issues in the valley. Now, what are the bigger questions we have to raise here? It would be too easy to celebrate this as a kind of environmental success story, and indeed there is a hidden set of tensions. One is that, ironically, a lot of the pressures in California on water arise from degrading water quality due to groundwater contamination from wafer production in Silicon Valley. Now, a lot of that production has been outsourced and moved overseas, but there's a legacy of water degradation and pollution. And interestingly, current debates about the technology race with China and the push to re-domesticate supply chains are going to pose additional challenges for water quality. Water quantity is also a very significant issue. Data centers are some of the largest energy users in the world. That might sound hard to believe, but combined, the internet uses about 10% of global electricity, and is predicted to use closer to 20% by 2030. And some uses, of course, are very intensive, like cryptocurrency, like video streaming. So water cooling demands from these data centers are also enormous. So the environmental injustice here is that the digital water technologies that promise to enhance water monitoring, save migratory birds, support continued agricultural production and capital accumulation are predicated on a set of industrial technologies that are actually worsening water crises at multiple scales. So I'll go on to the second case study, and I only have 10 minutes left, and then we'll open it up for questions. So now we're moving somewhere else. We're moving to urban water in the global south. Of course, the urban water challenge in the global water south is a paradigmatic challenge of exclusion, where large numbers of residents of cities in the global south do not have piped water supply, and in many cases pay more for water. These are typically lower income consumers that are paying more per unit volume of water than wealthier citizens who might have piped water in their homes. So there are many complex reasons why this is the case: rapid urbanization, informal property rights, dynamics of social inclusion and exclusion. So we don't have time to discuss the dynamic, but let's say that the fragmentation of access to water supply and the inequitable access to water supply in the global south is well known. So to address this problem, proponents argue that digital devices provide a solution. The instrumentation of digital networks is one aspect of this. So automated leak detection. Many cities actually have enough water for all their residents, but they have such poor operational management that they leak a lot of that water before it gets to the citizens. So if you can digitize your network, automate leak detection, you can reduce the gap between supply and demand. You can essentially operate your system more efficiently. But the other aspect of this is at the customer interface, where you use digital devices to create prepaid meters, mobile payments, and water ATMs. These devices, they're like slot machines, and the casino metaphor, I think, is slightly appropriate here, where you put in your cash and you get out small sachets or bottles of water. Now, opponents argue that the digital agenda, far from solving the water crisis of the South, will actually make it worse. And indeed, there is some evidence that this is the case, that digitalization increases inequities in access. Often digitalization comes with a surveillance apparatus where you are imposing fees, you are creating a sensor network that monitors where networks were previously not monitored. And that means that you're implementing a pay for service rather than free water services in many neighborhoods that used to have imperfect water supplies, maybe one pump or well or standpipe for a community, but at least it was free. Now they have more options, but they have to pay. And for low-income consumers, that is a very significant challenge. Digital apps also tend to aggregate and financialize water-related costs that low-income households previously paid in small amounts. So often these digital apps require a certain stream of payment, or you get cut off, or you lose your account, or you lose your points. Analogous to social media, the goal is to create a predictable revenue stream for the water companies or the water suppliers, but that imposes a regular payment on the part of low-income consumers that they are not able to effectively manage. Now, all of that assumes that these consumers actually have internet access, that they have digital devices, which we know is often not the case. So this even more negatively affects consumers without internet access. It, again, deepens the digital divide. So ironically, although digital water proponents argue that the increase in efficiency and financial sustainability of water providers can be enhanced through digital technologies, opponents argue that these techniques will further deepen inequality. They will entrench inequalities that their proponents are seeking to address. So let's briefly turn to consider some of the challenges, critiques, and debates. Beyond the operational challenges I've discussed, there is a bigger question about regulation. This question has several dimensions, but let me briefly touch on data ownership and control. There is a deep irony in the digital world whereby if we harvest data from humans, we apply privacy rules, legislation, GDPR in the EU, for example. None of that protection exists with respect to the environment. That is, it is assumed environmental actors are non-humans, are devoid of personhood, cannot hold property rights, and do not deserve any privacy protections. That is increasingly coming under question. And I referred earlier to the debate about Indigenous data sovereignty, which is, I think, leading the debate around the safeguards one needs to deploy for environmental data, which should be treated as a global environmental commons. And the origins of that data in Indigenous territories should be recognized, bearing in mind that Indigenous communities, traditional territories extend across a significant proportion of the Earth's surface. And more broadly, I think we can also make a case for citizen control of environmental data pools. Currently, a lot of that data is harvested by companies, and it is proprietary private data. So we need to have a conversation about data, where it is stored, who owns it, how it can be accessed, the nefarious uses to which it can be put. This applies more to biodiversity data than water data, but still. And also the quality and integration of data, because there are still very significant quality concerns. Those quality concerns relate to the technology. I don't want to over-exaggerate the current state of the digital agenda. The sensors are not yet perfect. Power depends on better battery storage. Eventually, what we're going to do is move computation onto the sensor itself. That's still challenging technically, but currently there are still lags in data collection and very different ways of collecting data that make interoperability of data sets quite challenging. So no one is creating that architecture. Right now, we've got lots of fragmented data sets, which mimics so the fragmentation and the lack of regulation of the Internet of Things. So better data is necessary. Of course, that's still an insufficient condition for improved environmental governance if ethical issues are not addressed. So I'll conclude with a discussion of those ethical challenges. I've mentioned e-waste, obviously distributing sensors and nanosatellites creates a lot of e-waste on the Earth's surface or in space. And we should also be mindful of the enormous energy use of this combined digital apparatus. I mentioned earlier that the global internet represents about 10% of global electricity use, and its rate of increase is climbing faster than anything else. Those numbers might be surprising, but that is fairly well vetted data. And so by adding digital environmental governance to this exponential increase in energy use, we are ironically exacerbating climate change issues, something that the tech sector has not solved yet, although they're now waking up to that challenge. Another set of ethical issues relates to inclusion and exclusion. You're familiar with issues of algorithmic bias pertaining to humans. Algorithmic bias can equally affect non-humans, privileging certain types of water bodies, privileging certain aquatic organisms over others. Which do we choose to monitor? Which do we not monitor? These are very serious questions that also should be addressed in line with my comments about inclusion and exclusion of local communities and resource users, as well as the issues of cybersecurity and privacy. Finally, I think we need to have a serious conversation about whether and when we want to automate governance. I believe there is a lot of potential in real-time decision support systems. For example, it is now technically possible to implement real-time regulation systems for oil and gas pipelines, such that if there is a leak from an oil pipeline, which is a big issue here in Canada, the company is paying a fine in real time. Maybe it's $10,000 a minute. Maybe it's $1 million an hour, but there are ways to create incentives or more sophisticated incentives like auctions that really drive companies not only to minimize pollution, but to accelerate the climate transition and decarbonization. So that's one set of issues. But the real-time support systems also remove human control and agency from the decision-making process. Given how imperfect our political processes are for handling environmental issues, maybe that's a good thing, but maybe we don't desire this decision-making to be automated. Parallel to that is a debate about democratizing access to digital environmental data. One point of view espouses the claim that all data should be shared, that all data should be open, yet environmental data can often be misused. And so there's a serious conversation to be had about access to that data. and ownership of that data for the commons for the long term. These conversations are now being had at the international level. For example, the United Nations Environment Program is launching a major digital initiative, a digital transformation initiative that seeks to create a digital architecture for environmental data globally. But we're a very long way off from solving these questions. We're only beginning to identify these questions. I think it's very important for us to develop research agendas to deal with these issues, given the fast pace of innovation and the remarkable and aggressive unfolding of the digital tech agenda on the part of private actors. So I see a question in the chat from Corinne. I'd love to hear more on the global commons ownership of data. How far are we from this? I think we're very far from it, to tell you the truth. So corporations, of course, own a lot of private data sets, in part which they've acquired through their compliance obligations. So these are called environmental monitoring and information systems, or EMIS. So in a way, it was a logical extension for them to begin again claiming larger and larger data sets. And the fact that the next generation of nanosatellites is largely in the hands of private companies means that the proportion of environmental data that is private is going to increase rather than decrease. So maybe 40 years ago, when we launched our first Earth satellites with NASA, actually corporations were not very interested in environmental data. Now they're intensely interested. So in fact, we're not only fairly far from the global commons, we're getting farther because the big tech companies have woken up to the potential value of environmental data, and they've woken up to the fact that it is unprotected and therefore they can aggressively accumulate it. Now, some pretend, or perhaps honestly, are doing this for some good agenda. I'll give you one example of Planet. They used to be called Planet Labs. It's a satellite company that was founded by ex-NASA engineers. They had these nanosatellites that image the Earth in real time. So at some time in the past 24 hours, their satellites flew over your head. They're these modular satellites that read the surface of the Earth like a line scanner. They call their satellites doves, right? This notion of peace and harmony. And their goal is to share all this environmental data for the betterment of humanity. Now, whether that's actually the case is another question. So the work of the United Nations, UNEP, on this is I would say, noble, but we're very, very far from being able to even establish a shared architecture for global environmental data, much less begin to house all the data in that architecture. So in a way, I'm warning of a risk. That is, if we don't act soon, we won't have the opportunity to establish that global commons. Much of this environmental data will be privately held. And that is actually a very significant concern for the future. I see a hand from Gabrielle.
Yes, hi, Karen. It was really a nice talk. And I wanted to have your impression on the question, to what extent do state agencies depend already on private environmental data?
So that's a great question. And I think it varies tremendously by state. So there are states with internal data gathering capacities. So the United States actually, because of the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, actually has a fairly good, robust set of water monitoring facilities. For example, USGS, Groundwater, very extensive data, actually available in real time. Canada, ironically, does not. We under monitor our data. We have fewer hydrometric monitoring stations than Belgium in Canada. And one of the reasons we under monitor is because if you don't monitor the water, well, then fewer problems are detected. And in a commodity dependent nation, oil and gas, forestry, mining, there is been a consistent decision on the part of governments not to monitor water, kind of a see no evil, hear no evil. This is obviously a huge political and environmental problem. But this means that Canada is more vulnerable to private companies harvesting the data and then selling it back to us and we don't control it ourselves. So you're right. I think that the broader implication of your question is, before we build the global commons, we better be working with our own nation states to start building repositories of environmental data, so that we aren't in this position of buying back our own data from private companies who harvested it before us.
Thank you very much.
I hope some of you are talking to the French government about precisely this. If you aren't, you should start. So I have a question for you, which may be something you want to follow up as a group after, which is, having learned about these issues and the kind of imperative of grappling with the threat, if you like, to the commons of the harvesting of digital environmental data, what actions could you take in your own professional or personal lives? I think these are great research topics for the students on the call. I think this is very important for government policymakers to begin discussing internally and creating a digital environmental ownership agenda. For those of you who are from environmental organizations, there are interesting sources for you to get informed, like Wild Labs, which is a collective and a cooperative of environmental professionals who are sharing open source environmental monitoring data to enable environmental NGOs to engage in citizen science and monitoring using open source data rather than buying environmental monitoring services. So I'm not wanting to tell you what to do, but I think there's lots of ways to follow up on this agenda, and it's just very important that you do so.
But just a question, because I'm reacting to one of your answer. A lot of private companies are now sending starships and the satellites. So these private satellites networks, is it the future of surveying environmental data? So, I mean, the public will never be able to follow, right?
Well, okay, so of course, with the whole rise of nano satellites and, for example, Elon Musk and Starlink, right? Planet that is already up. There's a kind of new space race all around dominating the nano satellite market. And but it depends what you load onto the nano satellites. Elon Musk is not, every nano satellite will have different sensors, and only some sensors are very useful for environmental purposes. Elon Musk is not loading up his satellites with those sensors at the moment, as far as I know. He's really about, the communications market, not about the environmental data market yet. And simultaneously, there are some very interesting companies like GHGSat and the Environmental Defense Fund's Methane Sat, for example, that are engaging in their own monitoring initiatives. I'm not saying these are good or bad, but I'm just saying it's a little more complex than big tech dominates the world, because there are still, with respect to satellites, very active government satellite networks. And the initiatives that are most focused on environment are still deploying technology that's a little older, but it's not necessarily nanosatellite technology. And the nanosatellite agenda is more focused on a very narrow race to dominate essentially the internet and cell phone communication market. So I think there's actually an opening here. I'm not saying citizens are going to dominate the satellite market, but I do think there's a very interesting opportunity for geopolitically. For example, the EU has been involved in very interesting discussions about alternative satellite networks. And you may be aware of some of the work that's been done on animal monitoring and ecology in collaboration with the Russian Space Agency and the EU. So let's say that maybe ordinary citizens can't control it, but nation states are vying for control of some of this market. And it's important that environmental data be part of those discussions. That is if you like this, the room to maneuver to make sure robust environmental monitoring satellite networks are partly controlled by maybe coalitions of nation states. There's still room to act, and some of those are underway. less with respect to water than biodiversity, conservation, and climate and methane, but still, I think there's an opening. My comment, though, was referring not to satellites so much as environmental sensor networks. So satellites still don't have the degree of resolution that enables us to make very high precision, accurate local observations. And so when I was referring to wild labs, for example, they're a paradigmatic digital citizen science organization, but they don't use satellite data. They use mostly environmental sensor networks. And that's where I think there's some really interesting citizen science that can be done.